Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of American cultural history. In these lectures, we're going to be covering a discussion of culture in the Jim Crow era, which covers roughly from the end of Reconstruction in the late 1870s, really all the way through the Civil Rights Movement. But in these lectures, we're going to be covering through roughly the World War I era, and perhaps dipping a little bit into the early 1920s. And what we'll find is that as much of the nation was segregated during this time, American culture was largely segregated in many ways, and African Americans developed their own culture, separate and apart from that of mainstream white America. After the end of Reconstruction in 1877, the United States slid into the Jim Crow era. The nation, and particularly the South, grew increasingly segregated. A series of Jim Crow laws were passed in the South, mandating separate facilities for black and white, separate rail cars, separate water fountains, separate schools, and so on. Such laws were upheld as constitutional in the Supreme Court decision Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which determined that separate trolley cars in Louisiana were constitutional as long as they were equal. Thus, for the next 60 years or so, the United States was governed by the maxim of separate but equal. Of course, the nation was very good at enforcing the separate part of this equation, while obviously overlooking the requirement that those facilities be equal. Under these laws, even in many places in the North, blacks were often required to sit in their own section in theaters and at ball games, if they were allowed entry at all. In the South, blacks typically had to eat at their own restaurants or carry out food through the back door. Plessy v. Ferguson ushered in an era of repression of blacks in the South, poverty and inequality for blacks in the North. The idea of separate but equal, which was upheld in the Plessy case, was then put into effect in many dozens of Jim Crow laws passed in states throughout the country and especially the South. These laws governed almost any imaginable interaction between whites and blacks. In 1905, for instance, Georgia passed a law mandating separate bank facilities for white and black. In 1915, Oklahoma mandated separate telephone booths. And in New Orleans, there was even a law requiring separate prostitutes for white and black. According to the historian C. Van Woodward, the Plessy decision unleashed the floodgates of racial aggression. In the realm of culture, this meant that a host of racist images and tropes became commonplace in the newspapers and literature of the day. Cartoons from this era strike the modern eye as hopelessly offensive, but such depictions were common at that time, and in fact indicate the prevailing view of the country. One of the common images in cartoons of this era referenced the idea of the white man's burden, that it is the white man's duty to uplift and Christianize and bring morality to the downtrodden races of the world. This was particularly common in the age of imperialism after the Spanish-American War in 1898. In essence, in these cartoons, anything not white is looked down upon, and many non-whites would be lumped together in these cartoons. They were often depicted as primates or as children. Blacks in America had to deal with this kind of treatment all the time. People of color, it was thought at that time, needed to be governed and protected. They weren't capable of taking care of themselves. Even worse was the outright racism of many, particularly in the South. Benjamin Tillman, governor and later U.S. Senator from South Carolina, vilified blacks as an ignorant and debased and debauched race. One of the most powerful and long-standing pieces of evidence of the racism of that era was the popular film Birth of a Nation, which was made by the popular filmmaker and director D.W. Griffith in 1915. Griffith, by that point, had become the equivalent of the Steven Spielberg or George Lucas of his day. Through his early films with the company Biograph, he had already established himself as one of the leading filmmakers of the day. And some of the themes that were evident in Birth of a Nation were developed in some of those earlier films, particularly the idea of white superiority. It was very common in those early Griffith films to see non-white characters sacrificing themselves. They were often put into weak positions of inferiority. There was a theme in many of the films of castration, or colonial or mixed race love. In general, though, non-whites were often depicted as criminals and rapists and beneath the consideration of whites. Griffith's masterpiece was the 1915 release, Birth of a Nation. This was, without question, a groundbreaking film, introducing many technological breakthroughs, including wide action shots. There were many scenes featuring riding horses in great herds and many other things, explosions and so on. There were lots of novel techniques deployed with the film, and film historians view it, certainly, as groundbreaking for that. More important, though, it also stands as a monument of the racism of that day. It was a hugely popular film, staying in theaters for 4 or 5 years, and eventually it was viewed as a rallying point by the Ku Klux Klan, which was revived in the aftermath of the making of the film. Griffith argued that the film was historically accurate, and it did actually reflect the opinions of many of the top scholars of that day. It was based very closely on Thomas Dixon's novel The Klansman, published in 1905, and some sections in the movie are lifted almost word for word from that book. It also reflected some of the wisdom of the textbooks of that era, and no less than President Woodrow Wilson, who of course was highly educated himself in the realm of history. He showed the film in the White House and said, "It's like writing history with lightning, and the sad thing is, it's all so terribly true." Of course, the film wasn't actually true. It depicted the era of the Civil War and just after, when blacks had been freed from slavery. It was horribly racist in its depictions of that period, as blacks took over state houses and were utterly inept in the way they ran the government. Even worse, they were depicted as vicious, cruel racists in that time, running rampant through the town. Many of the actors in the film were white actors in blackface, which again only adds layers to the racist depiction for our modern eye, but as we've discussed previously in this course, was a common method at that time. Birth of a Nation, while it was wildly popular throughout the country, inspired a backlash among black Americans who recognized that its historical depiction of the Reconstruction era was hopelessly wrong and racist. Many blacks protested the film, and others actually undertook the process of making a counterfilm, which they hoped would depict a more realistic version of the history of that era and try to counteract the impact of Birth of a Nation. This counterfilm was called Birth of a Race, and beginning shortly after the launch of Birth of a Nation, blacks began to produce this film, which was partly written by the noted intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois and was directed by John W. Noble. This film presented blacks with an opportunity to protest, an opportunity perhaps to make money. However, the film ultimately was largely a failure. While it was initially designed as a way to counteract the racism of Birth of a Nation, ultimately the filmmakers decided to incorporate many other ethnic groups as well. And the final version of the film is a sweeping, broad, and largely clumsy view of the history of many different groups throughout all of history. World War I also played a role, as unfortunately for the makers of the film, the war broke out while they were in the process of filming, which contributed to the slowness in the release of the film. And also, the film was released during the peak of World War I's attention, and as soldiers were starting to come home, and so it really didn't get the attention that it deserved. Ultimately, as a counter to Birth of a Nation, Birth of a Race was little more than a blip on the radar. Nonetheless, we need to view some of the achievements of this counter film, even if it didn't do much to counteract Birth of a Nation. It was one of the first times that we see blacks beginning to organize and create their own propaganda campaign. W.E.B. Du Bois and other researchers of the film used facts and research and information to depict their own version of the story. It also marked one of the first significant rallying points for the NAACP, which we'll be talking about more in just a few minutes. And it was one of the first times that we saw blacks themselves as filmmakers. So, Birth of a Race marked a number of achievements for blacks, even though it didn't do much to actually counteract the impact of Birth of a Nation. One final example of the racism that was so prominent around the country was the unfortunate and horrific prominence of lynching throughout the nation. There were more than 3,000 recorded lynchings from the decades after the Civil War to 1920. And there likely were thousands more that were never reported. Lynching took on a sort of popular culture of its own, and in some cases became a form of entertainment. As you see in the picture here, large crowds often gathered to witness lynchings, and in some ways they resembled sporting events of that era. They might be advertised, and huge crowds of people came out. There was a celebratory atmosphere. You often see pictures of people smiling and seemingly enjoying themselves at these events. And they even took souvenirs with them. Body parts of the lynching victims were often mutilated and distributed amongst the crowd. This was obviously a horrific, unfortunate part of American history that we would like to forget. But like so many unpleasant elements of our history, in order to truly understand what the country was like, we have to accept and look at these events for what they were. In the next lecture, we'll talk about perhaps a happier aspect of African American history, the triumphant and dominant reign of the first black heavyweight boxing champion, Jack Johnson.